Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our conversation very briefly to a review of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid together. And the assumption here is that you've been following this work with me. If you haven't, learnstrong.net, you want to pay attention to the AP folder. I've given guided study now in lectures over Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. My assumption is that now you as an AP student have been following that information, and now we're going to have a little conversation before we move on in AP English. Okay? I want to do two things in this, what I'm going to call bridge lecture. It's kind of like a bridge from our study of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid to everything else that we will do for the rest of our time together in AP English. So I want to do two things. One, I want to review one last time why these three great epics are great epics. In other words, I don't want us to just take authority, right, whether it be mine or anybody else's. I don't want you to just go, right, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. They're like really important, right, because somebody told me they were important. I mean, remember what Mark Twain said about a classic, the book that everybody says you should read and nobody actually has read it. I don't want that to be our reason for us to say, yeah, these are great works of literature. So I want to give us some suggestions about why this is important stuff for us. And then secondly, I want to look ahead, because our learning theory connects new information to old information. We'll get to that in a moment. But the reality is that we're constantly asking about any new information. How does this relate back? Notice we played that game with the Odyssey. We had finished the Iliad and we said, how can I use the information I learned from my study of the Iliad to impress or understand my study of the Odyssey? Once we had finished with both of those and we met the Aeneid, how can I use the information of Iliad, Odyssey in our study of Aeneid? And notice that we played that game at 3A in every one of those lectures intentionally, right? So, let's ask the first question. Why are these three poems, taken collectively, considered great classics? Or, to quote from W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, monuments of an aging intellect? Like, what is it that makes them so? I think there's three reasons for your notes. Three, okay? One, we're going to argue poetic genius. That is to say, this is the way that I think we, in the West especially, begin to see and understand the patterns of existence, the patterns of life. These stories that we have said as we began our time together, stories that we tell, retell, accept, reject, that's foundational to what we kind of understand in regards to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid as being great works of literature. Okay? Number two, we're going to argue that not only is this great poetry, but these texts, all three of them, are instructional. That is to say, they have tremendous instructional value. We've been using this term propedeutic, didactic, instructional. In other words, you're supposed to learn something as you meet this. Remember that line that I emphasized from Aeneid 3:592, line 592? Let this mission challenge all our children, right? That's an important line. I think that Virgil was acutely aware, far more kind of self-aware in his writing of the Aeneid, as I said in my lectures on the Aeneid, than even anything happening in the Iliad, the Odyssey, that this text and all of these texts assumed were instructional, especially for the young, right? So you guys in mind, if you will. The other thing that I pointed out, and I've said this, and I think it's really important, I am convinced. Somebody asked me the other day, what's the one thing that people don't know about those three poems? And I said that they were all intentionally designed as religious texts. They tell us a lot about theology, they tell us a lot about the gods, they tell us about that relationship between the gods on the one hand, humans on the other, and then the artist-poet in the center, which is somehow going to be inspired by the muses. We have the invocation of the muse in all three of these poems. Why would the poet need to invoke the muse or the gods? Because these are poems that are instructional, specifically as it relates to issues of theology, religion, and the like. Finally, number three, well, I think, and by the way, there are a lot of other reasons that people can give to you why these are great works. These are the three I'm just going to mess with, okay? The third reason, not only is this great poetry, not only are these poems instructional, but I'm pretty convinced that the reason these poems are so important for us today is because they're disturbing. And by that, I mean they raise disturbing questions. And by the way, they did this during their own time. Think about Socrates when we meet Socrates here a little bit later, and we'll ask in Plato's Apology, why they're so upset at Socrates. Socrates understood intuitively there's some seriously disturbing questions in these three poems. Marcus Aurelius, I think, understood this, and I'm very convinced that St. Augustine understood the disturbing qualities of these poems. So let's review each in turn, and let's talk it through really quick, and let's see what we can come to in terms of an understanding. First of all, let's talk about these as great works of literature, right? I mean, they are the stories that will get told again and again and again. I mean, as we go through our study of AP, we will find ourselves again and again asking about these stories. Especially, not only as just their stories, but at that level too that we've always defined, especially at that rhetorical level. The characterization, the development of characterization, plot and setting, and the value of plot and setting. And of course, as we were studying it for all three of those poems at level 2B, this notion of symbolism and the power of irony and the ironic text. I mean, if we are an age, as postmoderns, if we are an age of skepticism and doubt, so much of it is born in the very beginning when we will meet these texts and they are so darkly ironic. It's clearly obvious that our poet was playing games with us, right? And that is to say, these poems remind us that we are, in fact, the stories that we are told, the stories that we tell, the stories we accept, the stories that we reject. You can't accept or reject a story until you've actually engaged it, which is why I always argue that if you want to do what Francis Bacon says in studies, read by deputy, and let somebody like me tell you a little bit about these poems, or you read some kind of online summaries or whatever, that's not the same thing as reading a text. You really disallow yourself the pain, frustration, and sometimes joy, right, joined in actually reading these poems. And of course, let's just remind ourselves, in reading these poems, that means always in translation, unless, of course, we're students of Greek and Latin. And, of course, if we're talking about Homer, these were poems that were, we believe, told long before they were written down, right? In other words, these are really, really ancient stories. And as I've tried to argue in earlier lectures, if you're interested in these poems and ancient stories, there will be others as well. I'm immediately thinking, of course, of the Vedic texts and the Bhagavad Gita and other kinds of texts that go way, way back in time. The Epic of Gilgamesh immediately comes to mind as well, as a text that we will look at a little bit later in our time together. But all of these texts are the stories that somehow compose your life. Let me say it to you this way. If right now we picked up your phone, that, by the way, you're supposed to have out of sight, right? And we were to look at your playlist of the music that's there, that playlist of all those songs, that's the story in some way, one strand of a story, that is you. You chose to put those stories there, or you listen to some kind of online source that categorizes text for you and musical text for you. It does it around a certain ideology or whatever, right? That's the stories that are you, right? Those stories are yours. You kind of embrace those stories. Well, we said there are three observations we're making about why these are great texts. If the first is it's just a great read. They're great stories, and they're valuable stories in and of themselves from a poetic perspective. Secondly, and I think vitally, these are texts that have to be understood as propedeutic, as instructional, didactic. We are supposed to learn something, and by we, I don't just mean you guys, I mean these texts from the very beginning were designed to teach something. They were to give some kind of information. Now, how specifically they do that, I think is, of course, the real marvel of why we continue to study these texts. I've had students that will say, after a few lectures on a few books of one of these three poems, you know what, I just decided to go ahead and read the whole thing because I started to realize some of the questions that you're asking, philosophically asking through the study of Homer and Virgil, that's legitimate questions that I probably need to engage in on my own level. And I think that's right. These texts speak to the human condition. They tell us what we care about. They show us what we used to care about and maybe what we don't care about so much anymore. For example, if you read these texts and you have zero belief in some kind of deity or God or gods as understood in these texts, you're going to read these texts, understand these texts in a different kind of way than if you really believe in Zeus or in Jove, right? I mean, if you see the world as somehow controlled or dominated in that way, or patterned in that way, determined in that way, you're going to have a different rendering of these texts. There's a couple of prisms, though, that I can share with us, and to some degree, we've mentioned this before, but we'll come back to it. One way to look at the power of these texts is to look at the integral model of Ken Wilber, the American philosopher that I've shared with you before. I think makes a lot of sense. His four quadrants theory, you can obviously do your own research on this in more detail. A text like Sense and Soul can give you the bare bones of this. flesh it out for you. I'll only give you just the very bare bones. But you'll remember that we kind of have a cross. I could do this on the whiteboard, but I won't. And you have an interior, you have an exterior, you have an individual, and you have a collective. And you kind of can look at those four quadrants, and you can look at the upper right, for example, that is to say, the physiological, biological, the external in the individual. And you can ask, what specifically do these poems have to say about that? For example, we're told in all three of these poems that there was a time long ago when human beings were way stronger than they are now. We're usually, of course, talking about men. That is to say, there was a time when, for example, we hear about a rock that Turnus will pick up at the end of the Aeneid, in Aeneid 12, right? And we're told 12 men used to be able to pick up that rock, reminding us, of course, of the famous rock of Hector. Same thing being said in the Iliad. In other words, there was a time when men were a lot stronger than they are today. That is to say, roughly 19 BCE, when the poem is published for readers of the Aeneid. In other words, there's some notion that there's a de-evolution in human strength. Maybe that's the argument that's being made, right? In the upper left quadrant, that is to say, the inside in the individual, moral development comes to mind. We can think about the questions that are being understood in the idea of moral development, especially as we shared it in that notion that we move from an egocentric to an ethnocentric to possibly a world-centric view of moral development. And when we're young, egocentric, I do what I do because I want to do it and nobody can tell me otherwise. It doesn't last long because the group, the tribe, the family, the religion, the nation, whatever, the ethnocentric moral position is the position of the group, and you kind of buy into that or you get jacked. And then beyond that, there's the question of, well, what if I had been raised somewhere differently? Would I have a different understanding of certain kinds of moral ideas, and to that degree, a world-centric view? So we'll ask about all three of these poems. What is the moral position? Is it okay to come in clandestinely and to kill a bunch of men while they're sleeping? Iliad 10. Or, of course, the same question will happen with our two that go out into the fields, of the sleeping warriors in the Aeneid. Same thing. Is it okay to slaughter sleeping soldiers, or is that not a very courageous thing to do? Are you okay if you're Odysseus to come home, for example, and to kill all those suitors because they don't have any weapons because you've removed all the weapons? What's our view on that? Of course, another upper left quadrant concern is epistemology and the whole notion of what it is that you know. Notice in these poems we'll play that game as well, and we'll come back to that one in a bit. In the lower left, that's that cultural inside kind of understanding with a collective of the group. The way in which whole groups have cultural values, that is to say a certain understanding of group concerns of ethics and morals. How do we understand that when we study a text like this? Or ontologically, what is it that we have that we can say about the understanding of how we perceive the value of the human? It's fascinating to look at these three poems, for example, from just the perspective of burial rites. Sometimes it's a big deal, other times it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal that somebody gets jacked but they don't get burial. But it's pretty clear that you're supposed to be giving proper burial to the individuals that you care about, right? We see that in all three of those poems, don't we? Of course, in the lower right quadrant, that systems theory understanding from village to town to city, and to think that, of course, all three of these poems have something to do with city or town or place. That is to say, Troy, Ithaca, and Rome. Although Rome is, of course, something far into the future, it's still clear in our reading of the Aeneid that Rome stands as the central figure of the entire poem. Of course, that has something to do with the issues of politics. Another way to see this, by the way, and we could look at all three of these poems from this perspective. I'm not going to spend our time now doing this. I feel like I did quite a bit of this in our conversations in the poem itself, and I just want you to think about it. But of course, another way to see this, another prism, if you will, is to simply say that in human existence, there's four things that really seem to matter. Epistemology, what you know. Right? We can go, as we've said, from that position of absolute certainty in terms of what I know, to complete relativity, the idea that there is no absolute truth at all. Of course, we pointed out what we call the performative contradiction. To say there are no absolutes is to posit an absolute, and therefore is somewhat illogical. And then there's the position in between that we have called the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. To what degree, epistemologically, do all three of these poems say something to humans about what it is that we can know, what it is that the gods can know? That's fascinating as well. Why does it seem to be the case that sometimes the gods know, sometimes the gods don't know? So what is up with that, right? I mean, how can Hera fool Zeus if Zeus is omnipotent and knows everything? But she does. And she convinces him to have sex with her, and then she puts him to sleep. Doesn't he see this coming? Did he not know that something was up? Right? Or for example, at the end of the Aeneid, you'll remember, Turnus says to his sister, Jutina, I always knew that it was you, and it wasn't actually my chariot master at all. It was actually you. I've known this all along from the moment that you started your dissension project and et cetera, but now it's time for me to go and do my thing. What do you mean he knew? How could he know? Epistemology. The second ontology. All human existence is always asking the question, who are you and how do you know? The epistemological question. Who are you? Who are you? What makes you you? What makes you special? What gives you value in some way? And we'll ask this question over and over again in all three of these texts. Notice how it's fundamental to the Odyssey that everybody wants to know who Odysseus is. And notice that in that famous Polyphemus scene, he says, I'm nobody. And of course, we play that game all the time. You know, I'm nobody, who are you? The Emily Dickinson poem comes to mind. Right? The idea of how we know who you know that you are. And how do you translate that? And what are the stories? We think about, of course, Odysseus immediately. What are the stories that define who you are? Looking back with hindsight, Dido should know from the very story that Aeneas tells in Aeneid 2 and 3. That Aeneas is going to bolt. She should know that, right? Because that's who Aeneas is. He is a man of pietas. He's going to do what the gods tell him to do. He will override his desire to be with Dido to do what the gods tell him to do. Why is Dido then so shocked and so upset and devastated when he finally decides to bolt? Or has he actually lied to her? That leads us, of course, to the third thing, that third possible prism we can look through. The question of ethics, morals. What is right and what is wrong? Is it okay to lie if you lie to get away with something? Is it okay to deceive if the gods have told you that it's okay to deceive? Well, why is it okay for the gods to be so deceptive and for humans to get jacked for it? Why is it, for example, the case that the gods can sleep with anyone they want, rape anyone they want, in fact, and get away with it? It's like no big deal, ha ha ha. And yet humans, well, Paris will take Helen away. Now, whether she goes willingly or not, the texts are never clear. But Paris does to Helen exactly what Jupiter or Zeus will do 1,000 times. And yet, for that, we have all kinds of nasty that will fall on the heads of a whole bunch of people. Collateral damage and the like. And that collateral damage will lead us to the fourth prism through which we can see these poems, and that is the political prism. Oh, don't talk about politics, I hate politics. No. You can't even say that, because the moment that you say that, you're using language. And language is that which is created between us so that we can talk about how we get along with each other, or we don't. That's called politics, right? The polis is just simply the gathering. What do these texts say about the way we get on? The way that we understand our relationship to each other. Do I have a responsibility to take care of you? Well, the ghost of Patroclus comes to Achilles and says, yeah, you do. Even though Patroclus is dead. Can you please give me a proper burial, so that I can get into the underworld and I can take care of business? By Aeneid 6, we understand why that's such a big deal. Remember that Elpenor has to be buried after Odysseus comes back from the land of the underworld, or the afterlife, or however you want to think of it, right? So in other words, this notion of how we get on with each other, like this one. What kind of leader is Agamemnon? What kind of leader is Aeneas? What kind of leader is Odysseus? Odysseus knows that he's got to sail through Scylla and Charybdis, doesn't tell his men. Why? Because he knows a whole bunch of them are going to die. And he don't want to tell them. Why? Well, because they're going to be afraid. They don't want to go, and I need them to go through there, so I'm not going to tell them. Very interesting. What kind of leaders? What kind of leaders make great heroes? That is a very interesting question, because we have three different examples. We have the example of Achilles, we have the example of Odysseus, and we have the example of Aeneas. And all three of them are very similar in some ways. Notice how all three of them can get really, really enraged and upset. They can just start jacking people, right? And of course, they're also, to some degree, great thinkers. Achilles is a great thinker. Anyone who says otherwise has not read the poem. Book 9, he turns down all the Scooby Snacks of the world. He doesn't play the game that Paris plays in the Judgment of Paris. He says, I'm not interested in any of it. Why? Well, because he's a certain kind of leader. He sees the world in very clear black and white. And his Scooby Snack Time has been taken from him in regards to Briseis. And to that degree, he's not interested anymore. Agamemnon has insulted him. But it's pretty clear that all of a sudden Achilles is no longer certain. I call this in a lecture, the crisis of faith. He doesn't know what he believes in anymore. Everything he's been told is important in his life. That is to say, Time and Kleos, right? Scooby Snacks and fame. He's not sure he believes in them anymore. And to that degree, he's like, I don't even know if I don't even know how I want to be here. He, in fact, imagines that he might just pick up and leave. If it's not for the death of Patroclus, he probably would have. Right. Well, I think what we're supposed to learn, it's clear, and that line that I read from the Aeneid comes back, I think, really important in Aeneid 3. Virgil knew exactly what he was saying when he said this. Let this mission challenge all our children. And no question, this is one of the central reasons why I believe these three poems continue to have such relevance. All right? There's a third reason, and I think this is one of those reasons that become more powerful the longer our civilization that we call Western civilization, whatever that actually is, right? But we can define Western civilization as a group of people who collectively said, these three poems are going to matter to us. That's one way, by the way, to define Western culture. Which does beg the question, if culture, Western culture, no longer treasures these three poems, then is it really Western culture anymore? That is a fair question, by the way, to ask. And I think that we need to be disturbed by the questions. I mean, there are so many disturbing questions after every one of these lectures. You guys are always asking, like, well, yeah, what about? And then just fill in the blank, right? And I will point out, again, what I said before. This disturbance of these three poems, this disturbance was happening in its own time. In fact, if I can say this, I'm pretty convinced that the bard, whoever he was or she was, Homer, and for sure Virgil, knew exactly that there was a lot of disturbing stuff that was happening here, questions that were being raised. I'm only going to pay attention to three really quickly. I think we've treated all of these in our lectures, but I just want to resurrect at least three. Obviously, there could be way, way more, right? I mean, obviously, but let's at least look at three. One, the issue of conflict resolution and the possibility of peace and how you ever get there. If you were to build a civilization around these three poems, how would conflict resolution happen? Because inevitably there's going to be conflict and people aren't going to get on together. How do you resolve that? What, by dropping rocks on each other's heads or sticking pointy things through each other's body? Especially in the Aeneid, it always seems to be the mouth. Did you notice that? So that while somebody's screaming or whatever in gruesome pain, then the sword comes in